So welcome to this workshop, which is being run by the Soil Health and Carbon Dynamics Topic Advisory Group for the Land Use for Net Zero Hub. So we call ourselves the Soils Tag. And we have convened a group of experts who have insider knowledge really of specific areas of soil data and soil health data to have a discussion around their experiences and their insights with that data, and then to dig into questions 17 to 20 from the Land Use Framework for England consultation, where we hope to gain insights that will help us to respond to that consultation. So welcome everybody. My name's Ellen Fay. I'm from the Sustainable Soils Alliance and I co-lead the Soils Tag along with my co-lead here, Pete Smith. Hi, Pete. We'll dive straight into the first session, which is going to be a very short overview of sort of 5 minutes each from the participants who are contributing to the workshop. And we'll go around the table, if you like, in order. We might have a contribution in a minute from somebody who wasn't able to join on time. And then Pete's going to share the next session, which is looking at specific questions. So Zach, if we could just have the list of participants, that'd be really helpful so we can all see who's here. Each participant has prepared a slide, which we will show in order. So I'm going to hand over first of all to Professor Steve Hallett from the University of Cranfield to talk a little bit about the soil data, the soil survey data of England and Wales. Hi, Steve.
Hi, hello. I'm sorry, I didn't receive any instruction to prepare a slide, so I don't have that.
No worries, that's
Definitely
fine.
talk to the data that we have, and I'm very pleased to do so this afternoon. And very good, good afternoon to everyone, and thanks for joining. I'm Steve Hallett. I'm Professor of Applied Environmental Informatics at Cranfield University, and I have to say I joined what was the soil survey as it came out of the civil service and joined what became Cranfield University many years ago. And it's been through a number of iterations. It started off as the Soil Survey and Land Research Centre, and then the National Soil Resources Institute, and now in the current guise, we are the Cranfield Environment Centre. So Cranfield, as many may know, have the duty of looking after and curating the national soil map in all its many guises. And there are versions of the data that cover roughly 1/3 to 2/3 of the country in detail at areas which are representative of the landscapes that they sit in. And over a period of time, the national soil map also became constructed to sort of fill in the gaps between that hodgepodge of the larger scale maps. And the national soil map, originally it was in 7 map sheets, became a digital version, and then it was redrawn and vectorized, and now is held in our land information system, which is at landis.org.uk. I'll pop a few notes in the apologies. I'll circulate some slides if that helps. But the Landis website contains information about the range of soil data sets held at Cranfield, and also the properties of those maps as well. So we have the maps at various different scales. We have thematic maps that look at particular aspects of, as if you like, soil health being particular interest. And then we have the soil properties, both for things like representative profiles and soil auger bores across the country. There's about 250,000 of those. And then we also have the properties for the national map itself with the polygons and the GIS data as well. So these data sets are really the sort of the definitive map and properties of soils data that we have. In addition to that, then we've been preparing a number of thematic interpretations of those soil maps, which can be used for a range of different things, for agricultural modeling, for crop suitability modeling, and linking that data with other types of data for more civil society applications as well. So I mean, that's by way of a short introduction, Ellen. I mean, I'm very happy to carry on, but I think that gives everyone a flavour. So the Landis website, perhaps I could just direct people to, gives an idea of the families of soil that we have. So I'll pop that link in the chat now. Thanks, Ellen.
Thanks so much, Steve. Yeah, that's absolutely perfect. Yeah, apologies if you didn't get didn't get the slide request, and it's simply just an overview. So that's been absolutely spot on. Thanks so much for that. I'm going to pass over now to Matt Aikenhead from. If we just stay on the thank you. If we just stay on Matt's slide. Thanks so much. Who is going to talk about a piece of work that uses the type of information that Steve's been talking about to do something innovative. So over to you, Matt, to take us through what you've been working on in terms of soil, carbon, and peatland mapping.
Okay. Can everyone hear me okay? Excellent. Okay. So we have what we call the Scottish Soil Database at the James Hutton Institute, which is part of the National Soil Inventory of Scotland. And that is a collection of data from multiple soil surveys, grid-based surveys across the whole country and other ones that are combined. My slides just vanished from the screen, I think, but I've still got my own one up here.
Yes,
there we are.
Thank you.
So in the particular piece of work that Ellen mentioned, what we've been doing is trying to update our mapping of peatland. So we've been using the Scottish Soil Database to develop an AI-based model for estimating the carbon concentration and bulk density at different depths in a 10-metre grid across Scotland. And that is then used to work out where this model predicts the presence or absence of peat. So that is the first step in that. And then what we've done is, once we've estimated where there is peat, we've used a variety of legacy data sets to look for evidence of particular peatland condition classes. And that's the legend you can see on the left-hand side here. So this is a peatland condition classification system, which is not quite the current formal UK recognised one, but we're working towards this with colleagues from Cranfield and UKCEH and AFBI in Northern Ireland and various other places. So these data sets are going to be freely available in GIS format, and we're also putting them on a series of story maps for which there's a link there. This has largely been done responsibly and funded by the Scottish Government, but we work quite closely with people like Nature Scot and SEPA, but also the National Farmers Union of Scotland and various other regulatory bodies to provide this data and to work with them on how they can use them for peatland restoration and other types of restoration activities across Scotland.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Matt. That's brilliant. Yeah, really interesting piece of work. We actually did a little talking heads on that, which will be on the Lund's website soon if you want to learn more. Okay, right, Graham, I think if we go over to you, Graham is from CPRE, and CPRE have done quite a bit of work around the agricultural land classification system. So Graham, if you'd like to take us through what we most need to bear in mind in terms of ALC, including your thoughts, or Ellie was going to be presenting this, Ellie Brody from CPRE, because she's done a piece of work looking at where ALC might be slightly stretched or nuanced, to my understanding. Yeah. So over to you, Graham.
Yeah, thanks, Ellen. And as you said, Ellie Brody did this work for us in more detail. I have worked on this for quite some time. We're really a user of this data set rather than a holder of this data set. People will be familiar with the agricultural land classification system. Applies to England and Wales. CPRE works in the English area, different system for Scotland. Just a brief overview of this. I mean, it's the data set that's largely available on the Magic website is the 1 to 250,000 data set that was prepared pre-really 1988. There are other more detailed maps available there, which is mapping that was done at a more local scale pre-1988 and post-1988. are loaded up there largely from MAF soil sampling. The data set is largely open access because it's in Magic. And we, of course, use it for our own policy advocacy work. I'm not a soil scientist. I would call myself a soil specialist as a policy advocate. But we have used that data in our applied work in looking at the importance of the agricultural land classification system for assessing what stock we have of good quality land and the implications of built development and flooding particularly. So that was in a report called Building on Food Security, and the map to the left, not very visible here, is an overlay though of East Anglia, East Midlands and grade 1 soil land quality overlaid with Environment Agency Zone 3 flood risk maps done by a colleague in JAS using the Magic database. And what it actually shows is that the land in grade 1 mapping, something like 58% of grade 1 land is in zone 3 flood risk, which is a 1 to 100, 1 in a 100-year chance of flooding from riverine flooding, 1 in 200-year chance from saline flooding. So we're very mindful of the risks of flooding, but also that report looks at built development. So the main use, of course, of the agricultural land classification system is for local authorities, particularly to assess land quality in their area and then apply that in their own local plan development. But clearly, developers also will use that mapping, or in principle should be using that mapping to avoid ALC land in their own applications. Because in national planning policy, there is a policy which protects the highest grade lands, grades 1, 2 to 3A, from development and prefers use of lower quality land for development. So activists also use it to identify such land. So that's a very brief canter through the sort of the mapping. What I would say, though, is the review that Ellie's done shows that, of course, a main concern, and I've been aware of this for some time, is this mapping relies on, I think it's 1940s data for temperature and 1960s to 1980s data for rainfall. It uses site data, climate data, and soil data on a scientific basis to put together a sort of prediction of where this land is, but that hasn't been updated since. I think that's a major concern because ADAS did some work in 2020, which showed that although we have something like 37% of our English land is grades 1 to 3A, that could fall to around 16% by 2050. So highly relevant to the land use framework dates to 2050, but also to 2080 down to about 6%. So I think the key issue for us reviewing this is that I suppose thinking about what's just been said by Stephen about the sort of kind of data that's available, this mapping was actually produced in the 1960s. It hasn't really been updated since to accommodate the climate and rainfall change data, but it also was done at that time at a very large scale. I've talked to some of the MAFFD people who were involved, and they were looking over fences to have a look and hedges to see what was in fields to do their assessments. So it was very broad brush and very strategic. But of course, it hasn't got the level of granular detail we might need now to make better assessments about land use, particularly production of food and crops that this land identifies. And I guess also it doesn't deal with, it doesn't have good coverage across the country because the strategic maps cover the whole of England, but the more detailed mapping from survey data is very patchy, only covers about 8% of England. And principally around towns and cities. Another issue for us is the fact that lowland peatland, and peatland's obviously just referred to in the work of James Hutton, but obviously a lot of that soil since the mapping was done in the 60s will have degraded and the carbon lost and soil's gone down to mineral soil, so the soil quality may be much reduced. And if we're using this kind of mapping to assess the stock of good quality land for food production for the next 2 to 3 decades, what we need to be clear of is what the actual stock is, meaning much better data set for the land use framework. I could go into much more detail, that's Ellen, but I won't do so now, if that's all right, if that's a reasonably gentle canter through.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much, Graham. Brilliant. So lots to bear in mind already. Next on our list was Crispin. As I said, Crispin joining I think, around about 3 o'clock. So we'll come back to Crispin. And Tim, if you're happy for us to go to you now to hear about the land app, that would be brilliant.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I think there are probably 3 slides on this. But yeah, so we've just, as most of you will know about Land App, we're just trying to make the process of managing land and making good land management decisions simple and easy. So yeah, we've just introduced the soil survey in our mobile app, which allows you to either capture data on the ground in a very low cost way in a georeference point, or indeed gather data from people that have processed that information so that you have a bit of a view of that on your land. So these are just some of the things that we have as key attributes for that. So yes, which was structured slightly differently before as a screenshot. This looks a bit more aesthetic. But yeah, so that's one thing. Then the next slide, if you have that, yeah, just to show that the way that we've structured everything we do is making sure that the farmers own the data. So if the farmer's capturing the data, they own the data, and that data can be passed through the value chain however they want. But yeah, fundamentally, it's the those that are creating the data that own the data in the software. So we're farm data safe. So yeah, just a very key component of us, and just a kind of, most of you will know this already, but Land App comes from my own frustration on our family farm. So very much advocating for farmers big and small, and making sure that everyone's part of the marketplace, so to speak. And then the final slide, yeah, just gives a little bit of a look at that user interface. But yeah, the ability to generate surveys on the ground in a structured format, capture the data that's of relevance, and then all of that data is synced back up onto the Land App map, and then from there it can be passed wherever it needs to go. So yeah, just trying to make sure that the tech is really working in the way that it needs, so that you can capture the data that's required. And things like, yeah, agricultural land classification, I think it's really interesting. Like, what are the raw data points that are required, both on soil, but also land use and characteristics that could maybe, in a more live, dynamic way, improve the ever evolving versions of the agricultural land classification or the national character areas. So we're also hoping that a lot more of this sort of crowdsourced raw data can flow into more extrapolated models that can be used for decision making at different points of the value chain. So just trying to connect the dots in a wise and logical way. So yeah, that's us.
Thanks so much, Tim. So yeah, so Tim and actually Tom is very much giving that perspective of, this great resource that has been created in various different places. How is that then being applied by people, the people who manage the land, in this case, farmers who manage sort of 70% of our land. So we'll go to, so thanks Tim. We'll go to Tom from Soil Benchmark to hear a bit about what your approach is. I think in my mind, it's we have the Land App on one end of the spectrum, useful spectrum, and the other very end of this useful spectrum is sort of how that information then informs what happens on the farm. So over to you, Tom.
Super. Thanks very much, Annie, and yeah, good to follow Tim. So you may not have come across us. We're a much younger company than Land App. We only launched our platform in November 2023, so 15 or 16 months. We're now up to just over 9% of England using the software, so it's growing quickly, but we're not quite at Land App scale yet. I think the difference, and Tim, maybe you can comment on this, but Land App's obviously done a fantastic job being taken up with lots of land agents and people making those decisions around how different, across a whole estate, say what you're doing with different bits of land and how you make those decisions. I guess where we've tried to fit in is we work primarily with agronomists, and it's for that portion of the farm that is being farmed, portion of the estate that's being farmed. How can we use soil data to help with those very particular kind of agronomic decisions? So that's kind of our bit, but we're a platform a bit similar to the Land App, can log on online and make a farm, etc., etc. It's not too different. I guess in terms of soil, so we started out focused on soil. My co-founder Ben actually was at the James Hutton Institute and used to work a bit with Matt, I think. And we started out providing soil management plans for farms who'd signed up for SFI in England. So there's one of the payment uh, sort of options was farms in England could get £6 a hectare to create a soil management plan. About 35,000 farms signed up. It was by far the most popular of the SFI options. It's a sort of entry level thing. And a lot of agronomists came to us and said, creating these plans is going to be a pain because there's lots of risk mapping involved, coming up with proposals field by field. And so we built some software that auto-populates all the risk maps. So effectively, we've built our own soil layers there based on LiDAR data. So that helps assess things like runoff risk, obviously based on slope. We ended up not using the Cranfield land use data as great as it is. We had some trouble with the licensing, but ended up going with BGS parent material model data, which has given us kind of granular enough. It's about 1 to 50,000 that data set, and that's given us kind of enough field level scope to be able to create soil zones within field for those things like erosion risk, and then also proximity to watercourse. So we have a partnership like Tim as well with Ordnance Survey, and that uses Ordnance Survey water data. So it's kind of using background data to create pre-populate risk maps for farms. And then I guess a bit like Tim as well, we bring on farm level data, so particularly soil sample data. We have ways that farms can just upload soil samples, and we use AI to automatically extract information from lab reports or soil analysis, and map that into the platform and then use it for specific jobs on farm that agronomists need. So one is a soil management plan, but we've expanded recently into manure management plans. So across England and Wales particularly, there's lots of these rules in MBZs or farming rules for water around risk maps and spreading maps, stuff like that. And then nutrient management planning. And we're kind of building out, I guess, more on those agronomists toolkit and trying to use soil data primarily to help farms and agronomists with managing that and managing a lot of the compliance burden around where they need to use soil data. So we've ended up, we're very farmer and kind of agronomist focused in terms of where we've built the product out, but a bit like Landat, from that basis, we've ended up probably building up some quite interesting data sets. So we would have now tens of thousands of soil organic matter sample results that have been added to the platform. Again, in terms of data ownership, that's owned by the farmer, uploaded by the agronomist. They can delete it whenever they want, but we can try and use that to start build out models across the country. So I don't know, maybe Landat as well have quite a lot, but I thought we have a hopefully quite an interesting data set of things like soil organic matter, pH, pK, Mg, those sorts of soil results. We now have tens of thousands of those samples being uploaded to our platform and geo reference. So I'll leave it there as well. But yeah, happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Tom. That was brilliant. So yeah, carrying on that kind of how building up data sets question, I'm going to hand over to Dave Nicholson from Agricarbon to talk a bit about what you guys get up to.
Sure. Hi. Afternoon, everybody. Very nice to be here. So I suspect some of you may have heard of Agricarbon, but broadly what we do is we measure soil organic carbon, the clues in the name, I guess. And we do that through an end-to-end process that starts with a stratification and sample design, then includes in-field sampling using the machines, one of which we've got a photo of there on the left-hand side, to collect core samples down to a meter of depth. And those cores can be then divided into up to 4 different depth layers. And each one of those subsamples of the core is then analyzed in our automated carbon analysis lab up in Dundee in Scotland. And there's a clip or a short, small photo of the part of the lab there. So the idea behind Agricarbon was to really overcome one of the perceived barriers of directly measuring soil carbon, which was the cost. So we've built a process that has really industrialized that process and managed to get the cost down really, really low. So at some of our larger scale projects, we're now delivering soil carbon measurements at around sort of £3 to £5 per hectare. And those measurements are done with very high precision, very high accuracy. Every individual core is geotagged. Every individual sample is analyzed separately, so we can provide both bulk density and soil organic carbon measurements at individual samples, and then we aggregate those up at different scales so we can provide information on a field level on a farm level or up to project level. And at each one of those levels, we can provide uncertainty alongside those measurements as well. We also provide, optionally provide nutrient data. We don't do that nutrient analysis ourselves. We then take the samples while we're in the field, but we then use a third-party provider to actually measurement all those sort of key soil nutrients. In terms of the data set, I think we're up to about 500,000 individual samples now, mostly in the UK, but we've actually operated across 17 different countries across Europe and also into North America. But we think we have probably one of the largest data sets, possibly in the world, of soil carbon measurements. That data is owned by the client. Talk a little bit about who that means in a second. We as Agricarbon have certain rights to use that data for internal purposes, and I've given a few of the ones there. What we are starting to do is find ways to aggregate that data and then use that as part of our analysis. So we've recently introduced a new element of our reporting that can tell a client or a farmer on a particular field how the soil carbon on that field compares to a peer group of fields that are nearby and in the same land use. So we can say, for example, that compared to 100 fields within a 50-mile radius of this field that are also being used for arable purposes, your soil carbon is higher or lower or about the same as everybody else's. So there are ways in which we can use that data, but fundamentally it's owned by the customer. In terms of how we provide that data, we have historically given it as an Excel file, not probably the most glamorous way of doing it. We're just moving to an online portal, so our customers can access that information online. And one of the other benefits of being online is we can update it, as we can bring in new forms of analysis over time. We've retained the option to give the output of our analysis as a PDF, and for some customers, they would rather have it as raw data, so we can also provide it as a CSV format. In terms of the decisions that are being made, so we think of customers, we broadly have three groups of customers. We do a lot of work with food and beverage companies, so your Nestle's and Danones of the world, who are looking for ways in which they can quantify their net zero progress in terms of offsetting. So they have asked us to work with farmers in their supply chain to help understand a baseline of the carbon that's in their fields right now. And then as they start to implement regen ag practices over the next few years, we'll come back and remeasure and provide a measurement of change that the food and beverage companies can use for their inset reporting. We also work a lot with carbon project developers who, again, want to have a measured change on the land for the farmers that are enrolled in those carbon programs, so they can quantify the carbon sequestration and monetize that. And we've also got a group of customers who are sort of landowners and are looking at really understanding the carbon that's in their soil for natural capital purposes. So maybe being able to actually understand and quantify and value the carbon in their land right now. We also do some work with academics and other research groups for various soil surveys and soil studies. We are also starting to look beyond directly measuring data. So primarily my role is to look at how do we extend Agricarbon service into starting to model carbon change over time. So how do we take that data set we've acquired and actually use it to inform some of our soil carbon models? And we think that combining the measurement and the modeling, we hope, will provide a better service for some of our customers who are looking to move beyond just a measurement approach.
Thanks so much, Dave. That's really, really interesting. So yeah, quite a good spread of different things going on in this space. And really, really interesting. I don't think Crispin has managed to join us yet. So we might circle back to Crispin when he does. But in the meantime, I think we might go to the next session now that we've had this overview. And I'll pass over to Pete, but I think if we could just flag up on the screen the specific questions from the land use framework consultation that we're going to be focusing on. And yeah, I'm going to go on mute. Over to you, Pete. Yeah.
Thanks, Ellie. So we got these 4 questions, but we're going to tackle 19 and 20 together. So we've got a while to go through these questions. I think from what I've heard from your talks, you're going to have quite a lot to say about what data could be made available, what data would we need, and what data could be made more freely available and more accessible to allow the land use strategy to work. So the first one is, what changes in how government spatial data is presented or shared to increase its value in decision making and make it more accessible? And I heard some bits and pieces there about using a data set that maybe wasn't the one that...
Sorry, I do apologise. I hate to interrupt, but Crispin has just joined, so maybe you want to, Ellie, do you want to go back to the original agenda? Sorry, Pete.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
How do you feel about that, Pete? Should we do that now?
I'm cool with that. Yeah, great.
Yeah, fine. Crispin, hi and welcome. Thank you so much for rushing from wherever you've been to just to join this meeting. So we've just had you. If Zach, can you go back to if you can go back to the slides, the slide with all the participants on it, so that Crispin just knows who he's sitting with. So we've just had an overview, Crispin, from experts who look after data sets, who work with data sets, who understand data sets and are producing new data sets. So brilliant to have you here to just give us a quick 5-minute overview of what you've done with the alert system, because it's a bit of a convergence of all of that in one place for a very, very specific application. So lovely to see you. And over to you if you're ready to dive us straight in.
Sorry, could you just give me a minute? I've just
absolutely
footed straight off another meeting, and
yeah,
sorry,
that's fine.
Just bear with me a tick.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, the alert system, it's something that we've been developing over the last 5 or 6 years or so. Initially with catchment sensitive farming advisors in mind, and it's basically a tool that helps them to kind of survey the landscape from the desktops using best available Earth observation data, and kind of just a kind of easily accessible tool for them to be able to view data sets relating to potential kind of risks relating to agricultural runoff. And I was going to see if I can work out how to share a screen on Zoom. Bear with me.
Zach, you might need to enable that as I can from here.
Yeah, it says cannot start screen share while the other parts of screen sharing. Okay. Can you see my screen now?
Yeah, we can see it quickly.
Yeah, cool. Okay. So the tool itself basically sits on the Farming Advice Service website, and it's in the catchment sensitive farming section. And there's the URL there. I can put the URL into the chat, maybe, if I can work out how to do that after I've spoken about it. We just scroll down. There are 2 versions of it. One that's for use on a desktop, so it's kind of larger screen format. Another one you can use on a mobile telephone, so it's a kind of small screen format. And basically, it's a web mapping application with a bunch of data layers that you can kind of interact with and kind of display one on top of the other. So just give you a really high level kind of overview of it. I'll just go into the map now. So there are 2 different versions within the desktop. One that's more kind of color friendly for people with color impairments. Just click on the agreement there, and then you're in. So the data layers are grouped in themes. So ones that might be of interest in relation to soils are the hydrology layers. For instance, we've got probable overland flow pathways that have been derived from the high resolution satellite, LiDAR data that we've got for the whole of England. So this is very much a kind of England centric application. and a lot of the data layers on here are derived from the Environment Agency LiDAR data, which is something I think is really important for lots of different kind of applications in relation to soil and risk. And so yeah, we've got overland flow pathways, we've got potential ponding areas, we've got the depth reclassification of the Cranfield soil data. So that's just a kind of view-only version of that. We've got slope thresholds in there derived from the LiDAR data. We've got various different flavors of the LiDAR data itself, and also sentinel satellite imagery. You can choose whatever date of imagery is available, going back to the full archive, back to about 2017, I think, for Sentinel-2, and then you can go back even further if you want to. You can even look at Landsat data on here as well. So and just zoom into a random part of the country. There's a Farringdon there. Show you the overland flow pathway data sets. So these flow pathway data sets are coloured up according to the mean slope along each pathway segment. They're based on 1 hectare, minimum of 1 hectare flow contributions. So that any point along the line is likely to have an upstream contribution of about 1 hectare. And you can see they're coloured up according to the mean slope along each of those segments. Might be easier to see if I show it with the LiDAR data that's been used to generate them. And you can see these kind of potential ponding areas as well. They're useful for working out potentially where to put kind of agri-environment schemes such as kind of wetlands into arable landscapes or agricultural landscapes. So yeah, various different flavors of the LiDAR data. One of my particular favorites is just the height data itself, and we got it set up with a dynamic contrast on here. So if I go to the level of the whole country and turn that data layer on, and so there's basically the elevation for the whole of the country, and as you zoom in, the contrast adjusts to take into account the variation in elevation within the display extent at the time. So if you zoom in, for instance, the areas around the fens of near the wash, you'll start to see very soon it'll update. Just bear with it. Sometimes it takes a moment or two. You can see the variation of the height within that area that effectively used to be salt marsh before it was drained back in history. And you can see clearly the old rodons that were basically the old channels of the dendritic kind of channels of the salt marshes. You can actually see the kind of stratigraphy in some places where you got these very wide, thick channels. They're probably the really ancient rodons. Then you can see this one here that kind of is superimposed on top of that really old one. That's probably a younger kind of channel. But this is a data set that I feel will be really useful for improving soil data. Especially in these kind of areas. So basically, what's going on here is where you've got the old salt marsh channels. It's generally a much more kind of compact, much more fine sediment that is as compacted as it can go, and then surrounding it, you've got a kind of peat layer. As it dries out, that's able to compact more than the sediment channel areas. So there's clearly some kind of difference in subsurface kind of construction going on there. So yeah, and if you look at the soil data in conjunction with that, you can see that there isn't really any definition that shows you any of that kind of variation that is almost certainly going to be important in those areas. So I think that's something that could be really important for improving soil data sets in the future. So yeah, as I mentioned, there's satellite imagery that you can view on the application as well. So near real-time satellite imagery. The data layer that you can see there is basically the high resolution imagery. You don't have any control over when this was captured, but with the Sentinel data, you can view data layers as recently as yesterday or a couple of days ago, and you can control what date it views as well. I'm just going to see if I can very quickly remember when there was a date that was possibly quite interesting. I've got a feeling there was one in 2024 in January. I think it was the 26th. Let's just see if we can. It was either the 26th or the 19th, I think. So yeah, there's the 26th of January, right? And then there's also another rendering of that data set that you can view, which really enhances the water visibility in the imagery. So I'm just going to turn that data layer on as well and apply the same date filter. So this is the Sentinel satellite water enhancement, and you can filter by date. So I'm going to apply the same date into that field there. Sorry. So 26th done, and let's see what happens. Again, it might take just a moment for it to load up.
While you do that, then Pete, I think if we get ready to start asking we'll start looking at the actual specific questions. This has been really, really helpful, Crispin, just to understand exactly at what level you can apply these data sets and to what practical kind of understanding.
Okay.
Yeah, that looks like a fantastic. Yeah. So, Crispin,
go on, let's start the questions.
Yeah, we'd better move on to the questions because we've got about 40 minutes left before the end of the meeting. Could you screen back?
Thank you so much, Crispin.
Yep. Thank you. So we'll go back to the questions, please. There we are. So we have, as I mentioned just before we broke, we've got four questions to talk about. Questions 17 to 20. We're going to deal with questions 19 and 20 together. But we'll go through them in order. We got one slide for each one, which breaks it down into the sub questions. So what I propose is we just go through them in order, and you can just pop your hand up and just have your say. What we're trying to do is just collect, because you're all people who have data, who are collecting data and have tools that are available, and clearly have ideas about how these could be used to enhance the land framework. The land use framework. So that's what we're going to do. We're just going to capture your ideas. So let's go to the next slide, please. Question 17. Question 17 on the consultation asks what changes how government's spatial data is presented or shared could increase its value in decision making and make it more accessible. Could that be through 1, updating existing government tools at the portal and website, 2, changes to support use through private sector tools, bring the data from the different sectors together in commons portals or maps, increasing consistency across spatial and land data sets, more explanation or support of existing tools, apps and websites, greater use of geospatial indicators such as the unique property reference numbers, UPRNs, and Inspire IDs to allow data to be more easily displayed on maps, or we can suggest others. So would anybody like to if you could just put your hand up, and then we'll go over to you on any of these issues. Crispin, could you please mute? We're getting a bit of feedback.
Dave's got his hand up. Pete.
Yeah, I said Dave. Yeah, it's Dave.
Hi guys. Just very quickly on this one, I think one of the things that we've found when we've been exploring the use of this sort of data is we've used Google Earth Engine, and we've used that for 2 or 3 different purposes with several different developers. And I think that sort of third-party tool that has an enormous collection of existing data has been massively useful. It means we can speed up the development, significantly. That sort of API-driven access, I think, is essential. So I think what we found is there's lots of these different viewers, and Crispin, I think that was a really good example of one. But actually, when you're looking to be able to incorporate this sort of data into back-end systems, a beautiful viewer and a dashboard from a front end is all well and good, but actually what you want is programmatic access through APIs, ideally into a single service that is very robust, is very scalable, and has a very wide collection of different data sets on it. So for us, having something accessible through a platform like Google Earth Engine is really critical.
Fantastic. Thanks, Dave. Any other thoughts?
I'm going to put my hand up. I'm afraid I can't find my reaction on here.
Yeah, just put your hand up. It's fine.
I mean, Dave, in terms of your work, I mean, it was a question from your presentation, actually. To what extent you made it very clear that your data is owned by your customers. To what extent is there potential appetite for that to be in some way anonymized and shareable via an access portal?
It's an interesting question, because although you can anonymize the data, obviously you need to have the location data, so you can't anonymize it in the way that you might be able to anonymize certain other types of personal data. I think the way that we've started exploring is through aggregating the data, as I sort of referenced when I was chatting just now. And I think there are ways in which we can pull together data from a wide variety of fields and farms or projects within a region and provide that sort of information. So one of the conversations that we've talked a few times about with different parties is providing regional baselines. So because we have this data set that's continually being added to across the whole of the UK and more broadly, we could aggregate that up into large regional data sets and start to provide that sort of information. Obviously, as soon as you start to narrow it down to smaller and smaller geographic regions, you lose that anonymity. So there's a trade-off there about exactly what the right level of granularity we could provide is. But that's an area that we've started exploring and thinking about.
Great. Ellie.
Thanks. Yes, to jump in with my own questions also. I was really interested, Rob, really interested to hear between Crispin and about the DEFRA soil classifications and why they are specifically of use in this piece of work, and also to Steve, where is the difference if we think about those static pieces of data sets about soil rather than the dynamic ones that are collecting new soil health or carbon data, where we need to be thinking about texture classes and where or why we would be thinking about soil classification classes, just to get really clear what the difference might be and where one has more use than another or different use when thinking about land use and how to plan land use.
Very good. I wonder if Crispin would like to go first, and I'll follow. Just
sure, thank you. So yeah, the soil classification group, it's not my expertise, so but yeah, I can say a little bit about it. It's basically a framework for classifying soil that enables kind of non-expert users to use a soil data set. The soil data set from Cranfield is an incredibly complicated data set that most people wouldn't really have a clue how to use. So this classification has basically used soil associations from the NatMap vector data from Cranfield to categorize the soils into kind of 6 broad groups, and there are 12 subgroups. So so it helps people make an assessment kind of operationally about the different kind of soil groupings, and give people an idea about risks in relation to erosion and runoff in those soil subgroups. It's just basically a simplified version of the soil data. The version that is currently publicly available is just a view-only data set that's available through the data services platform on data.gov. And yeah, currently that's you can view it on a web map, but you can't do analysis with it at the moment. I don't know whether that would be changed in the future or not, but at the moment that's the state of play.
Maybe I'll just follow on, Crispin. That's really good introduction to it, actually. So the National Soil Map, NatMap, as we call it, has many hundreds of soil types in it that represent England and Wales. And we obviously work with colleagues, Matt and others in Scotland, to try and harmonise our classifications. Of course, the Scottish soil classification is rather different, being a sort of Catena-based approach from our taxonomic approach for soil classification. So the soil scientists have different systems for understanding the soil types, and they do get, as Crispin rightly said, very complex. And in the past, we have realized that the range of users who come looking for the soil data want a simplified version of that. And in fact, we took inspiration, I think, in New Zealand, where there is a soilscapes approach many years ago, and rather like this idea, and we developed our own simplified version of the national soil map, which has 24 classes, and this is our soilscapes map, and that's quite a generic but nonetheless a very useful classification. And we have, like everyone else, have our viewer with the data on it. I put a link in the chat. Apologies, I could have given a demonstration of it, but I didn't. But you can have a look at that. And then, as Crispin says, there are occasions when one wants a more specific and focused classification for particular applications, and the DEFRA soil classification has been that. We've also produced similar classifications for partners in the private sector who are doing things as well with agronomic applications, as well as other types of engineering classifications of soil in many other applications. And one observation I have from many years of working with soils data is when people ask for soil data, they don't mean that. What they mean is we'd like to have some property of the soils that helps me understand the particular problem that I have. So we spend a lot of time joining our data with other data sets, reinterpreting, reclassifying, harmonizing the data and making it available. And just on that last point, apologies, was it Dave mentioning rightly about the different modes of access? I mean, when we started, of course, it was paper maps were sent out, and then people would get their DVD through the post, and then they get their zip file of data and so on. And we're moving closer to the current time, and many of our users now have API access to the data, and that allows apps to be built that integrate data from multiple sources, and it sort of comes together at the point of the app. So I do feel that would be a good observation to make for the feedback, is that API access to all these different data sets allows data to be harmonized and at least integrated. And nobody else has mentioned it, so I'll just mention there's a really super app, UK Soils Observatory, UKSO, which colleagues can go and have a look at, that brings together a lot of soil data sets together, which some of our colleagues in BGS brilliantly put together. And that's just an example of how data sets from colleagues in Hutton, from Northern Ireland, from our own data, from CEH and so on, can all coexist in a very useful app. So I'll put a link to that in a moment. but maybe I'll stop. I don't want to, Ellen, go on. I can come back to any points, but I'll stop there. So APIs, yes, and reclassification is very important for interpreting what is ultimately a very complex field. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you both. And Matt.
Thanks, Pete. I'd really like to take advantage of Tim and Tom being on this call to focus on question E briefly. And what can the government do to support you in development of your tools, essentially to ensure that there is consistency in the data that is collected, the data is used from one project to another. So I guess you're not causing confusion with every farmer that you work with or every landowner that you use, that you work with. I don't know if either of you would like to take that.
Yeah. Oh, well, Tom.
No, you go for it first, Tim.
Yeah, I mean, the way that I think we're thinking about it is that essentially tools like LandApp are almost a skeleton through which data has to flow. It flows in and out, and the data that flows in and out of LandApp or soil benchmark or anything else has got to be consistent. Otherwise, you can never create consistent decision making, which means you can never have a market, and if you never have a market, nothing ever changes. So I think we're very much advocating for tools like soil benchmark, LandApp, etc. Because we have such a close interface with farmer and advisor decision making, then we can build our skeleton tools to support those decision making processes. But we need consistent data and sort of market standards that allow the data to have value. So I think that's probably what we're predominantly asking for, is making sure that the data is decision grade, and that it's consistent, and where possible, if we can support that data to be updated through verification on the ground, then that's, I think, a huge value add, because it's not secret stuff. There's value in the market being standardized. So market consistency, I think, is what we're advocating for through. So open data makes a lot of sense.
And you use the term standard, Tom. Does that sound helpful?
Sorry, what do you mean by that?
Well, a standard that can be applied to the type of data that is collected, so there's consistency across the board.
I think it depends for different markets, right? I guess in some things like nutrient analysis, standards have just evolved from the market. In terms of carbon, I just get I'll let agricarbon and Tim, you guys will know more about standards around carbon and what's being brought out there. I just wanted to comment briefly on I think for us, at least my view is that startups are always going to be well placed to really be really close to users and farmers particularly, and listen to what they need and what they need the information to do for them. I think it was a point that Stephen, you made earlier, that generally a farmer and advisor doesn't just want the data, they want it to do a specific job for them or solve a specific problem for them. It's not that they just, some people want the data as sort of nice wallpaper, but generally they want it to go and solve a specific problem for them. And I think startups are forced, because you don't have business otherwise, to really try and solve that bit of the puzzle of turning a data set into something that solves a problem for a farmer, or an advisor or that end user. So I think the best thing that government do to support that is recognize that the startup's always going to be the best placed person to try and do that end user interface, and try and make, as you say, data as publicly available, so that anyone, LandApp, Soil Benchmark, Soil Mentor, any of these apps have access to the same standard data, and it's up to them in a kind of competitive marketplace to go out and try and solve market needs with the same set of standard data. So API access is an obvious one. Trying to reduce costs, because we found it, not to pick on Cranfield as an example, for instance, but when we were first launching the app, just the costs, that even the mechanism by which we could have got hold of that data was so much more expensive per call or per kilometer squared than BGS data, that we ended up building our platform around BGS data. So for a small startup, particularly when you're getting off the ground, even what might seem like trivial costs to a big institution are massive. and having the ability to get trial data for free, be able to build APIs around free sample amounts of data. OS have a really good scheme where you can get £1,000 worth of kind of credits a month for free and build your system around basic bits of data. Having an understanding that making data sets really open like that, and then the ongoing costs don't kind of ramp up too much, allows startups to try around and do that end bit of turning that data into something that solves a problem for a farmer. So I think that will be my request, and maybe a bit nebulous, is try and have open data as far as possible. Make sure there's those kind of easy onboarding sandbox environments for startups, and then make sure that the ongoing data costs, if there have to be any at all, ideally, EA has been brilliant with just things that are on open government license. We never have to pay for them. But if there has to be a charge, it's kind of low. It scales per hectare, say, and it doesn't get ridiculous. That's really helpful for startups. Then go and do the final bit of the puzzle, which is turn big data sets into a tool that solves a problem for a farmer or an agronomist or whatever.
Yeah, and I might just quickly add on to Tom's point. I mean, basically, we all exist to support the farmers in the real world to make good decisions. It's the food we eat comes from these farms. They deliver the public services that we all rely on. So we're saying that even OS Master Map should go under the public sector government agreement. So it's made freely available for farmers so they can get paid public money to deliver public goods. And I think a lot of data sets that are commercial, really there's a conversation to have with Treasury or DEFRA to say, actually, do you know what? Let's make the data free for farmers. So let's make sure that money is recirculated in a more effective way so decision makers aren't blocked. So yeah, advocating Tom's point there.
Thank you, Tim and Tom. Graham, did you want to come in on this or a different point?
Yeah, well, no, it's picking up on this. I mean, it's fascinating, and the insights of the data sets were brilliant. And what's particularly on the ground and happening with farmers, I think my question is a very broad one. Is that the consultation question isn't very explicit about who the decision makers are, and I think unpacking that is quite important, because I think there's the issue of farmers as decision makers, which is clearly critical to how land is managed and maybe localized land use decision changes. But then we have sort of what's the next level up, and if we assume that is going to be a local authority or some form of local governance framework, then you have a sort of sub-regional level decision making, then you have a sort of regional and then national. And I suppose what I'm encouraged by is hearing that such really interesting stuff going on the ground. And there does look, from what's been said, potential to aggregate that. But I suppose is how does that get aggregated, building on that and what farmers are gathering for their own agronomic purposes, how does that get aggregated to a higher level to allow more strategic decision making to take place? Because I think that's both, it's not explicit in this question, but I think it's certainly implicit. The government will want to be making, how does the government make better decisions about strategic land use planning? And I think the challenge is how do you make, going back to the sort of complexities of the information we've been talking about, is how do you make those classifications and simplify them sufficient that decision makers can take them on board, given how complex soils can be. And then you look at all the different ecosystem services. But I do think it's kind of critical in terms of understanding their approach in the land use frameworks to multifunctionality and what might be the different services and benefits you'd be trying to promote, and how to avoid trade-offs and harness win-wins. And how do we take this from a very low, not low in any other sense in terms of the quality of the data, but in terms of the very granular level up to the highest levels, which I think is an important question for, but it's not explicit in the way they've framed this question in the land use framework consultation.
Great point, thanks, Graham. Any reflections on that? How do we aggregate this information you're collecting at the individual farmer level up to something that could be useful for, say, DEFRA?
Just a point to make. I think this is the beauty of a standardized data format. I mean, as much as it is possible, but because then aggregation is an effortless endeavor, right? It just gets aggregated on the standard. Because I think what we're seeing working with DEFRA is it's Treasury's investment into national resilience that is at the top level of this chain, and we need there to be able to be a lever pulled. So we need national resilience to grow by X amount productive capacity of farmland, and that filters down into like more SFI budget or whatever, or private sector investment going into improving soil quality, and all of that is impossible without a market standard. So yeah, aggregation should be simple if there's standardization.
I think if I can just jump in there a second, I think that the open source approach to data collection is all well and good, but I think there's a big issue when you try to aggregate it if you don't have confidence in how that data is being collected on the ground. So if you've got inconsistent data collection methodologies, you aren't going to be able to aggregate it, even if theoretically it's simple. So it just pushes the problem. Then you got the standards have got to be applied all the way through the chain.
Agreed.
I think it's hard.
Yeah.
Accredited advisors is how because you can't, we're saying that you need so many hectares of data to be captured that you have to empower those that are accredited on the ground or some way. Yeah, I agree. You don't want wishy-washy data flowing into the system 100%.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Before we move on to the next question, I think we need to move on quickly. Ellie and then Matt.
Yeah, I was just very briefly just going to try to sum up what I think I'm hearing. We're talking about standardization and access to the underlying data sets. Is that right? And then a degree of standardization around sort of protocols and methodologies and reasons for collecting new data. Am I understanding correctly from Dave and Tim?
I think
those are the sort of levels of standardization we're talking about.
I think that captures it really well, Ellie. Yeah, Matt.
Okay, yeah. It's a really interesting conversation. I'm just struck by the fact that in Scotland we have a soils database, and if people ask for it, we'll give them the data. And this is point data. It's not anonymized. If somebody wants that data to do some work with, then the assumption is the Scottish government paid for that. The taxpayer owns it. The farmer has given permission, if it's on farmed land, for the data to be given, because the underlying unspoken thing is the farmer's getting subsidies for the land, so they owe the data back to whoever provided them the subsidies. If this approach was tried in England, would that not work? Because this data does need to be publicly available for a lot of the things that people want to actually try and do.
Yeah, just briefly, it does say, for instance, in the SAM1 subsidy scheme, that soil organic matter samples which farmers are going to collect, DEFRA or the RPA have the right to go and ask for that information later. So they haven't actually worked out a system of how they're going to ask for it. Maybe they lean on people like LandApp or ourselves who've ended up aggregating it and mapping it for them. But technically, a farmer, when they've signed their SFI agreement, they probably didn't read all the small text, but they have agreed, in theory, to share that information with DEFRA. I think for other things like nutrient analysis or, say, soil organic carbon that's being collected with agricarbon, you just need to be a bit careful because, obviously, as has been said multiple times, that is the farmer's data that hasn't been collected as part of a subsidy scheme. And unless you're going to either pay farmers to share that or give them some other benefit, you can't go and sort of just commandeer it necessarily. But the soil organic matter data taken through SFI, for instance, you probably could just commandeer it because taken as part of the scheme.
Steve, can we bring you in on that one? We've got a different availability apparently between England and Scotland. Is there a good reason for not making that publicly available? Is it because it needs processing and there's a lot of back end work? If you're still there, Steve.
Sorry, who are you talking to, me or others?
Yes, Steve. Should I call you Stephen instead?
You can call me what you want, Pete.
No, I was just thinking about, that you hold the national source data for England. Yes. And Matt was saying that in Scotland we just give it away for free and it's not anonymised or anything. Is there a reason that we can't do that in England?
The data is held on behalf of DEFRA by Cranfield under license when there are historical reasons. But I have to say that we do make our data widely available in lots of different ways. We have sources of public data. I've mentioned in the chat our Soilscape viewer. I've mentioned the UKSO application that's there and all the soil properties that go with that, and we've developed our own apps, and others could do that.
Steve, so this wasn't about are you making it available for free, and it's not having a pop at you. It's to do with the anonymization. So Matt was saying, we give it away, and it will have a location, and the farmers have sort of tacitly agreed to that. So it's not a GPDR issue or something,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I mean, funnily enough, sorry, I was just sort of setting the scene, but yeah, I'll come on to that point because at the very highest level, we have the soilscapes, which is a broad brush approach, and I suppose even higher than that would be the DEFRA classification that Crispin just outlined. And then you sort of come down in detail, and you have the national soil map, and then you come down again, and you have regional maps, and then you come down again, and eventually you end up with a farm scale map. And I mean, I think that. Others have spoken before. One has to be extremely careful about sharing data that identifies individual enterprises on the ground, and if that is something that needs to be by permission. And so I think one would need to ensure that along with the data, that all the permissions were in place to make that data available. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but certainly as you change scale, you're zooming in until you eventually can see the individual enterprise on the ground, and so that can have implications if you're the next enterprise across the valley. You might be learning a lot about what your neighbors are up to. So I suspect that's probably the same with many types of data.
Just a quick, I know we've got to move on, but I'm here on our family farm, and I do wonder why I would be so nervous about soil data being shared with neighbouring farmers. I actually find it very hard to think of a single reason why that would be the case.
That's very good to hear. I mean, I suppose it may be, and not being a farmer myself, it's something that exercises my mind. I think where we have lots of farm scale mapping data, and I just feel that it's something that we need to be very respectful of. It was the data was collected by by the farmer, for the farmer, with the farmer, and it wasn't necessarily made collected on the basis of it then being put in as a national resource. I mean, the maps, we hold the maps, and you can come and have a look at them, but we don't have that data. I mean, I don't know whether you would yourselves, the data you collected for a farm, you'd make that data available. I guess that's the point we're debating, but.
Right, let's leave it there. I think we're running out of time. I'd like to move on to the next question, please. Could you advance the slides, please? So the question 18 is, what improvements could be made to how spatial data is captured, managed, or used to support land use decisions in the following sectors? Please give any reasons for your answer and specific suggestions. And that's the development and planning, such as environmental survey data, farming data, which is what we've mostly spoken about today, environment and forestry data, such as local and volunteer collected environmental records, recreation and access, such as accessible land, route data, and government, so it's published land and agricultural statistics. We talk mostly about the farming land. Is there anything else from these other sectors that we could leverage that would be useful for the land use framework? I mean, from the Environment Agency's point of view, I think, Crispin, you're using data from elsewhere to calculate flood risk and erosion risk and such like. Is this the sort of, could you also provide outputs that would feed into something larger?
Yeah, absolutely. One example here would be the national LiDAR data set that at the moment we have one kind of snapshot in time that's captured between 2017 and 2022, elevation data at very high resolution. In my opinion, I think it should be captured on a regular basis with a strategy behind it. At the moment, there aren't plans to capture a full data set on a regular 5-year or 10-year cycle, but I think there'd be massive value in doing that especially from a soils perspective, looking at things like where land slips have occurred and where you've got accretion of sediment at the bottom of dry valleys or what have you. But I think that's a kind of clear example, concrete example that would have some real value for the community.
Excellent, thank you. Tim?
Kind of the same point as before. I mean, land app, we are agnostic of, we're all land types. So I just think the bit that is missing is the same point I made before, that once you have market standards, in this case, it would likely be UK HAB data, then yeah, it would just support the decision making through the whole value chain. Because once you have that raw data feeding into the bottom, the soil type, the land use type, verified land use type, topography is obviously very good with the LiDAR, as Crispin was just saying. So I kind of feel like once there's a data standard, you can start to build planning application rules off it. You can start to structure SFI, CS, UCO rules off it. You can start to structure things like private sector investment into land, so like the Landscape Enterprise Network. So in terms of how data is captured, managed, and used, I think it's once there's a market standard, which we believe should be UK HAB, probably off OS Master Map, then actually you get a huge amount of market value derived from that, because all of a sudden everyone through the value chain is making congruent decisions on the same data format. And all the time that doesn't exist, a market can't exist, which means investment is always going to be burdened by admin. So yeah, standardization again is a precondition of a market. So yeah, that's what we would say.
And that would maybe help to harmonize some of these different data sets that are being collected for different reasons. I'm looking at the third one, local or volunteer collected environmental records. If there were standards associated with that, you make sure that you got quality assurance in some of the data sets coming in, right?
Yeah, on Dave's point about quality of data going into the system, I think if it's tagged with qualification of the individual that collected the data, that gives a little bit of what can be taken seriously or not. And yeah, I think local and volunteers, you could say, well, some data is better than nothing, but it's probably not as good as a qualified ecologist, and that's totally fine. Yeah.
Perfect, thank you. Any other thoughts on this? I mean, it would be a good idea, basically. I mean, to answer the consultation question, yes to all of the above. I think just getting those data sets together and hopefully they would be harmonized. There would need to be some standardization, harmonization done. But having that data that's used in planning and development, the environmental survey data, I think would be really useful, for example. Any other thoughts on this one before we move on to the last question? If not, then let's just pop up the last two questions, which we'll deal with together. What improvements are needed to the quality, availability, and accessibility of agricultural land classification data to support effective land use decisions? Dave, no, it wasn't Dave, was it? It was Graham was talking.
Yeah,
do you
want me to come in a bit more on this?
Yeah, and we'll take the two questions together. Which sources of spatial data government consider making free and easier to access, including via open licensing to increase their potential benefits? Yeah, Graham, coming to you. Sorry, I forgot who said it.
No, that's fine. Just to add a few more points on that. I mean, I think given the level of detail we've looked at with the farm type data that's coming through and the complexity and the detail and the quality of what's coming through, putting aside the point of standardization. I mean, look at the agricultural land classification data, which obviously originally for strategic data purposes, strategic planning purposes, it looks very crude and very out of date now, even more so than when we did this review, I think. So very much there's an urgent need for the whole of that data set to be reviewed so that it can be seen to be fit for purpose for making the big kind of strategic decisions that the government want to make through the land use framework. But I think also then more critically how they make those kind of decisions cascading down to a more local landscape level. I think the other thing to say is beyond the sort of update of the climate data and the temperature data, so it's actually fit for purpose, is, for current data on those aspects, is the simplification of understanding. Going back to my earlier point about how decision makers may look at this, in the end, I think they might look at it in fairly crude terms of, is this a grading of land that's, I didn't mention, but obviously in the National Planning Policy Framework, there's 3 grades of land, grade 1, 2, and 3A, which are actually better protected through planning than the lower grades of 3B, 4, and 5. But there's a big problem around the 3A, 3B distinction, which people see as a kind of sub-classification, but really it could be simpler, better if it was regarded as 6 different grades, then it was 1, 2, 3, then 4, 5, 6 which would simplify the reading of it. And I think also then we need the mapping to be consistent with that, because the current maps we have don't show the 3A, 3B distinction on a national scale. So we've got, not only the problem of the datedness of the data itself and that we have, but also the difficulty of communicating what that purports to show. So I think it needs to be revised and communicated better for the key decision makers going to have a look at it. And the last thing I'd make, not to hog the limelight, but to say is that it needs the people making the decisions to understand what they're dealing with. The last research done by DEFRA on application of this was in 2011, and it was on a sample basis that showed that the quality of agricultural land was not a gateway test for development, even though the policy is there in planning. The policy has been weakened, so the policy it needs to be stronger, but also how this data is applied at local authority level or higher, combined authority level, will be really critical, and people need to know what the data means and how to apply it in their land use decisions. It's quite broad stuff compared to the detail of what we've been discussing.
Brilliant, thank you, Graham. We've got 3 comments from Matt, Dave, and then Tom, and we're probably going to be running up against the time limit then. So Matt, over to you.
All right, thanks. I think a useful discussion point that'll take a lot longer around point 20 is there's a distinction. There's a spectrum here between making free or easier to access or not accessible. The type of data set that would be really useful is often has to be anonymized in some way because it's been captured with point data. The type of agreements that can be put in place that enable accredited organizations to make use of that type of site-specific data that then only produce spatial products that don't allow someone to reverse engineer to get that point-specific data, those data products can be really useful. So, for example, we make use of things like the IACS data, which is available to us under a special agreement, for us to then be able to produce national level mapping, which makes use of that, but it doesn't have individual reporting from farmers in it. So that kind of agreement of what you can do with it and what you can produce, that I think once a bit of work goes into that, it can actually be really helpful for that kind of thing.
That's very useful. Thanks, Matt. Steve, and then Tom, and then I think we have to bring it to a close.
Thanks, Pete. I'll just be very brief. I mean, I think just a big +1 to the previous conversation around the access to the Cranfield mapping and the costs of that. We've looked into it, and it's at a national level prohibitively expensive, even for a relatively well-established startup. The second thought, which is related to point 20 here, for us in particular, getting access to crop data and land use data, it would be enormously helpful, and particularly historical data. And I think, I can't remember who it was earlier referenced that some of this information has been provided to governments in return effectively for subsidies. So in some way, shape or form, that has sort of been paid for from the public purse. So the things like the crop map of England, having good access to that sort of data would be extremely helpful to us.
Brilliant, thanks, Dave.
Yep. I just wanted to follow on from that. I think the RPA holds a lot of this information. They were collecting detailed information on crop type land use for the last 20 years through BPS. They still hold those records. I know, spoken with the RPA, and basically they need someone internally to make it a priority. They've got a million things on, and they're busy with trying to get SFI, and it's just another job for them. So someone putting pressure on the RPA. I think the other thing that would be interesting in terms of some of these new SFI schemes is it would really help the development of new products to almost know which farmers or where different people have gone into different schemes. Potentially you get some GDPR things, but again, if that was made clear that you're accepting public money and those details will be made publicly available, that would be really helpful as well. So I think looking into a lot of what the RPA holds, that would be my key thing. And then if anything can be done on the Cranfields information in terms of like in Scotland it was paid for by the taxpayer originally, and everything can be done to make that more of a basis. That would be really good. Brilliant,
thank you, Tom. We've run out of time. If you've got any burning issues, or you feel like something has occurred to you about the questions that we've come up against, feel free. We'll capture in the chat, but feel free to email Ellie or Zach, whoever sent you the email, with those thoughts. And we'll try and capture those also in the report. Thanks very much for your time, and hopefully hopefully we'll manage to capture everything that you've said, and we can feed your thoughts and your wishes and your excellent ideas up to the consultation. Matt, did you want to say something? And Ryan?
No, just
No.
thumbs up.
Super
Okay.
quick,
Matt?
super quickly. Thank you very much. I mean, it's been as a kind of rich and technical a question as a conversation as we were hoping for. The deadline closes the end of April. I don't think that's going to be the end of this process, though, and I do, with the slightly cheeky SSA/Lunds hat on, see a value in this group continuing to meet, because I think there's an awful lot to share and an awful lot of knowledge here that can contribute to, really good advice to all four governments, in fact, about how they overcome some of these technical and policy issues. So it'd be great to get from you a sense of, your appetite for that. But yeah, thank you very much on behalf of the SSA as well as the Lunds Hub.
Yeah,
Brilliant.
thanks everybody. It's been fabulous.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Cheers.
you. Good.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good to see
Bye.
you.